بمديح الهادي تنتظم، ضاءت بالمختار الظلم وحلا في مولده النغم.
Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi and welcome to Finding Me in the ITV Networks. This time, a second interview with my very special guest, Professor Mudar Kassis, is from the Mawatin Institute for Democracy and Human Rights at the Birzeit University in Palestine. Last week we spoke about epistemology, about knowledge production, about knowledge, and how we should use it to change ourselves, to change our society, to change the ways we think in a better way, not to just imitate, not to just emulate, but to bring about better solutions to create a better humanity. And Professor made a point of stressing that we should shift the focus from the local to the global, because ultimately it is about humanity and not just about us. But today I'm going to discuss certain issues that I think are very relevant to our audience, and that is in terms of knowledge production, and the freedom of thought and the freedom of academic thought in a situation and in institutions where we still find ourselves very trapped by the colonial mindset, but also by a colonial epistemology. So with that, I'd like to say Ahlan Bek, and thank you again, Professor, for making this time to share your thoughts, and wonderful thoughts they are, because you presented some dynamic understandings in the previous discussion.
Thank you.
I want to ask you, because we spoke last week about the conversation around shifting from just thinking in questions to act as well, and to actions, that not to be one who endorses or maintains the status quo. So even in many instances, as individuals who are trying to contribute to a better society, to a better understanding, often you're caught in an institution that does not allow this change, and you spoke about that, and that's where you spoke about reform and revolution. How is it then that we're supposed to bring about this change? Do we then have to consider the option of revolution? And I'm asking this because one of the starting points is knowledge production, understanding knowledge, empowering yourself first in many ways, with the understanding, like you said, use the tools, and one of those tools is knowledge. But if I look at South Africa, the South African university, the South African education system, and I think about your university, Birzeit University, which was shut down, I think, for very many months. So you deny students access, you deny individual access to education, to learning, to empowering, to strengthening themselves. How then do you break out of this mold? How do you force a change without being revolutionary?
No, I think that seeking change, ultimately seeking radical change to the way this world is operating nowadays, is revolutionary on its own, and it cannot be done except through a revolutionary change. The question that I was alluding to last week was whether we have to have a revolution per se, in the sense of
Physically.
Of something physical that is life-consuming, time-consuming, economy-consuming, what have you, consuming. We probably are better off if we don't have to, but I don't really see that we can make it without having these revolutions. It is very unfortunate, but it's like fighting for freedom. We probably prefer to be free, because when you are a freedom fighter, you don't really actually have a choice not to be one. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we're not free when we are freedom fighters. Yeah. But we fight to become free, and in this sense, we revolutionize in order to become free again. What do we do with the system? It's very tricky, since we live with what we live, since the tools that we have are the available tools, and they are currently the master's tools. And since we really don't have many other choices, because whatever tools we will be producing now will be produced within this system, and they will be part of the system. We are ourselves, as a matter of fact, colonial products. And so the question about how to make the move, and to what extent shall we go sort of step by step, and to what extent shall we try to burst things up and change things overnight. That's usually the dilemma of people who are really working on change and etc. I think is a question that will never have a recipe type of an answer. Yeah, there will be no sort of clear recipe of, you know, you do 1, 2, 3 and then you will get 4. That's not how it works. That's not how it works, partially because we are all humans, partially because we belong to nature, which is frequently unpredictable, partially because the powers that we are struggling against are also smart, and they do change their tactics, and they do take action against us, and they do give us frequently the impression that, okay, we are convinced, now we will start changing peacefully. And the fact is, change does take place, and positive change can take place. I mean, look, for example, at things that did not come the easy way, but they came about. For example, labor rights in the West, in the capitalist West. There are labor rights to a major extent, especially up till recently, before the neo-colonial attack on these rights. There is social security. People, I mean, of course, there is quite significant polarization of wealth, etc., which is not acceptable and cannot be acceptable. But what I'm saying, what I'm alluding to, is that humanity has managed to achieve an 8-hour working day. It has managed to achieve certain types of equality. It has managed to achieve, at least at the formal level, the notion of citizenship for all citizens. It has managed to achieve certain systems of justice through courts or what have you. Not that they are perfect, not that they are our utmost dream, but they, compared to what we were having 100 years ago, we're much better off. So we shouldn't be sort of so pessimistic and fatalistic and sort of think that you know, there is no way out except somewhere in the future, probably only in heaven. No, actually, we can change our world, the world of today. We should be working on it. Now we have to be careful that the tools that we use are designed for a certain range, a certain limited possibility of change. So you're basically given, so to speak, a vehicle that runs only that much, and then the fuel is ended, or the engine is broken, or what have you. It's designed to go only that much. And what we have to do is to create a vehicle that goes further and further. What we have to do is not to, we shouldn't dump the vehicle away, but we should reform it. We should so that
improve on it.
Maybe improve, maybe change, maybe combine, maybe invent. I don't know. I mean, again, as I'm saying, there is no one recipe, and that is where diversity becomes extremely useful, and that is where you know, innovation, not capitalist innovation, but human innovation, comes in very handy. As a matter of fact, but then we have to realize that the distance we need to travel is calculated, and that we create a vehicle that is capable of moving particularly that distance, and not only pick and choose from the vehicles that are presented to us currently. Human rights, as a matter of fact, is one of those vehicles. It can take us a couple of steps further. A couple of steps
You've preempted my question, because I was going to say, you mentioned diversity and the way we look, and you say that, you know, it should be seen as a very positive understanding, embracing diversity. But what we see now in the last few years is actually a rejection of diversity in many of the Western states, in the sense of almost seeking a kind of rejection of diversity and rejection of pluralism. There is an obsession, if you see the fascist rising, the right wing in Europe, of course, Trump's America, etc., there isn't an embracing of that diversity. It's almost a rejection of that diversity and plurality. And so the question there is, and you just said it, that human rights is limited, because the application of the human rights to these particular humans, it doesn't seem to hold any ground. And so as somebody who's in an Institute of Democracy and Human Rights, and I think it's Duzinas who speaks about the end of human rights. Do you see that there is something like an end of human rights, or that we should now try and take this particular tool and maximize it so that it embraces all of humanity?
In a way, in a very symbolic manner, of course, everybody can see that. Everybody can see that. Even the shallow talk about human rights that was done by a very conservative American administration, for example, during the Bush era, both Bush eras actually. It was so shallow and meaningless, but even that doesn't exist today. They don't talk about it anymore. There are new priorities, etc. But then again, I was recently reading a book about many things, but in particular what I want to talk about here is something that is called the Bandung spirit. So there was this conference at Bandung in the early 50s of the past century, whereby leaders who are not actually in agreement, quite diverse if you want to use the current sort of jargon, quite diverse, socialist, capitalist, pro-English, pro-American, pro-French, pro-what have you, and pro-Soviet, of course, in part, then. They went in together and they've made a point of, for example, inviting representative delegations of countries that are not part of the colonial system. So, for example, the Vietnamese resistance was invited as the Vietnamese delegation and not the colonizers. And there was a discussion about whether to invite the Palestinians, and actually they did not invite the Palestinians then, because there was no Palestine. In the dynamics of international law that they were adopting. But the conference actually was setting precedents into the meaning of international relations and international law from a third world, so to speak, so-called a third world perspective. And the fact is that the original setup of for example, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that was written by the wife of the American president and some Lebanese pro-American minister who actually even was said to be on the payroll of the CIA at one point. It was a very imperial text altogether. Nonetheless, instead of refuting it, they took it and they interpreted it, and they forced an interpretation that is different to the extent, for example, that this eventually developed into the non-alignment movement that became a major bloc in the United Nations and that created so many precedents in international law that we in Palestine stick to with our teeth, because it looks like our only salvation. So we keep saying that according to international law, we have the right to self-determination. This is something that was designed at the UN. It was imperialist, but we're using it. We're using the tools of the master. Yeah. Around 1970, and sorry, I do not remember the years properly. Around 1970, there was a conference on human rights in Tehran under the Shah. And nonetheless, this was the conference where the resolution was made and then adopted by the UN that nations fighting for self-determination, national liberation movements, have the right to resistance in all the ways and tools they can have. This is something that is being rewritten today by the Americans and by the Israelis and by the EC, by the European community nowadays. They are going back away from this sort of right that has been enshrined in international law because they don't like it. And so just as they can rewrite international law, we should rewrite international law in the way we need it.
I'm going to ask you to pause there. We're going to a break, but when we come back, I want to take this exactly as you've opened up the discussion to talk about Palestinian human rights. Do Palestinians have human rights when they're not even considered human in many instances? But we'll see you after the break.
بمديح الهادي تنتظم ضاءت بالمختار الظلم وحلا في مولده النغم بمديح الهادي تنتظم ضاءت بالمختار الظلم وحلا في مولده النغم.
Assalamu alaikum rahmatullah, and welcome to the final segment of the second interview today on ITV Networks with Professor Mudar Kassis, and we're talking about democracy and human rights. And before we went on to the break, Professor, you were explaining about how this document, this very imperial document, is now being forced, a forced interpretation has been applied to this document to actually give value to the oppressed. But I am still hesitant about this notion of human rights. I feel it's a tool that's being used to coerce the hegemonized into following in the status quo, into believing something, but it's not a dream that they have written, to believe that there is such a thing as human rights, because in application, and this is right across the board, you can see it that in most instances human rights are rights that are valued for the white Christian male or for Western societies, but again in prioritization to the white person. Anybody who falls beyond that, their human rights become questionable, and it is applied only when there is a benefit or when there is something to be gained or measured against that. And a fundamental criterion of that analysis would be the recognition that in most instances Palestinians are not considered human, firstly, and the human rights of Palestinians are non-existent. I mean, because how is it that people in Gaza can be forced to live under those conditions, and the whole issue it has not been dismantled as yet? I mean, it doesn't make sense. If you look at it, the largest open-air prison in the world, their human rights, their right to life, and the conditions under which they live is deteriorating on a daily basis. What is the value of this tool that you speak about, of the tools of democracy, of the tools of human rights, when there is absolutely no change? I mean, Israel has just prevented a closed construction or the areas, I think the roadblocks where construction vehicles were allowed into Gaza, and that has also been closed now. The Palestinians in the rest of the occupied Palestinian territories, I mean, their human rights are questionable, in most instances not even considered human. What is the value of this tool?
Well, look, your discourse is very compelling, and you can easily agree with you and say there are no human rights, but this is not true. Allow me to take your own discourse as an example. You've started the very beginning of this discussion by saying something about being humans. Well, look, the term human in this part of the world some 60 years ago did not mean the same. Blacks were not human then. And now we accept the fact that we are all humans. So don't do the same thing with human rights. The fact that the hegemonizer wants to create this tool and use this tool and actually abuse this tool of human rights to focus our attention on certain issues, to make sort of mini liberals out of us or something of the sort, rather than talk about equality. There are different visions and different versions of how we perceive human rights. Let's go to the basics. First of all, the simple idea of the fact that if we are human, then we deserve life, we deserve dignity, we deserve equality, we deserve this, that, and the other just because we are human, is what the term rights mean. The fact that the rights are presented to us only in the framework of law that is created by the hegemonizer is actually a deformation of the notion of rights. It's not the rights. Yeah? It's the small part that the current hegemonized system wants to protect from those rights. It's a very miniature, actually, part, and it's a very selective part that has been designed and designated to serve certain purposes. But then we have our own purposes, and there's nothing to stop us from using the very same tool in a different technique and a different methodology, in a different way, to ensure that we realize what is it that we are up to and what is it that we deserve. Actually, to go back to our discussion earlier, to design the distance that we need to move. So what is it that we are seeking? I am not seeking the exclusion or the abolishing or the killing of the other. This is not what I am seeking. My own freedom. I am seeking freedom for all, rather than I don't want them to be free. See, the thing is, I do have an ethical position. If you like to look at the very recent history, if you remember the war on Lebanon, most of us felt that Israel lost that war, and I was thinking, how come we feel a victory if we have so many thousand people killed, so many hundreds of thousands of people had to flee their houses, so many thousands injured, so many houses demolished. Where is the victory? And you know where the victory was? The victory was that the Lebanese then had a very ethical standing during the war, before the war, and after the war, unlike the Israelis. And all those who were watching that war from the perspective of the weaker or of the hegemonized of Arabs, of the global South, so to speak, felt victory. If you make the capitalist count of the dollar value of the eventual outcomes of the war, we lost. We lost in terms of lives,
costs,
infrastructure, lives, blood, what have you. But we had the feeling of victory exactly because we felt that we are ethically superior to the enemy in that particular moment. I think that human rights it can be either a framework that frames us, or a vehicle that can be adapted to serve our purposes. I don't like the framing part. Unfortunately, most of the time human rights are taught and talked about as a framework, but we don't need more frames. We need to be unframed.
Okay, so we're very quickly running out of time, and I just want to touch lastly on the concept of coloniality and apartheid. How do you unpack these two?
I think apartheid is one more colonial tool. It's just an extreme case of the very same segregation of people into two parties, into two classes, into two types of people, into two different sets of rights, into two different lifestyles, into two different types of interest, etc. Probably apartheid is the most truthful expression of coloniality. It's very clear about it. It just tells you, that's where you belong. Don't
stay there.
Stay where you belong to. You don't own anymore. You don't own anything, actually. But every coloniality has an apartheid inside it. Whether you can see it, whether you legislate it, whether you can observe it or not, is another question, and it's a question of detail. It is really a question of detail. We probably nowadays, if you try to compare South Africa, where the apartheid was enshrined as a legal doctrine, where it was legislated, etc., and if you try to look at the similarities between South Africa and Palestine, South Africa and Sri Lanka Tamil, South Africa and
Burma.
the Hispanics and the non-Hispanics in America, South Africa, you'll find that what people sometimes perceive as an accidental similarity is not accidental at all. Actually, the similarities are all over the place, and probably apartheid exists all over the world in one form or another, to one extent or another, but it is embedded in the capitalist system and in colonialism together.
So would you say then, from all the experience that you've had and the teaching that you've done, that we have still a long way to go in the way in which we reorganize ourselves, or has the fight begun and the idea is now to make it an ethical fight, to maintain this ethical path and to reach that goal which you speak about in terms of a better humanity?
I think it's a very long way, but I also think that today we have very high-speed technique.
Alhamdulillah. Okay, that's a positive, very positive way of looking. We'll basically come to the end of the interview. I'd like you to leave us with a parting thought, please.
Well, again, I mean, let me say what I've been saying to my South African friends in the past couple of days. I don't think that we in Palestine can, counterstand the power of Israel. We will not be able to liberate ourselves through arms or through, direct bodily struggle or whatever. We need international solidarity, and I think that one of the great feelings that I have is that when I'm around in here, I feel so thankful to the fact that people are in solidarity with us, not because we ask them to do, but because they feel this is their global human duty. And probably this is what we really ought to develop in ourselves all over the world.
So would you then say that boycott, divestment, sanctions is the right way to go?
I think that Israel should be isolated as an apartheid colonial regime in the 21st century. I think that the world has an ethical and legal duty to counter-oppose Israeli actions in the West Bank. And whether it's boycott, sanctions, whether it's divestment, whether it's solidarity, which I think is even more important, it's actually, to my taste, more important to stand with the Palestinians than to stand against Israel. But it is necessary to do both. And probably today, boycott is the most efficient, peaceful means of resisting the colonial condition.
Thank you very much for that very powerful comment. And inshallah khair, there will be a time where we will see the Palestinians achieving that liberation and freedom
I'm
that
sure
they have
we
been.
will.
Yes, I'm sure you will too. I would like to see it in my lifetime though. But thank you, Professor, for sharing these moments and these very positive thoughts that you have had. And I'm touched by your positivity, especially coming from the conditions of extreme negativity that you find yourselves surrounded in. And that's, I think, perhaps for many South Africans, it's a wonderful stance to embrace, but also I think for Muslims, considering the level of Islamophobia in the world today. So thank you again. Fi amanillah, wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
قسما بالله رب العالمين ما ارتضينا غير دين الله دين فهو دين الحق دين الأنبياء إنه الإسلام نور وضياء هذا الدر وهذه الكلم بمديح الهادي تنتظم